The local Chamber of Commerce newsletter arrived on a Tuesday, and there on page 4 was my sister Linnea, smiling her perfectly symmetrical smile next to a headline that read, "Local entrepreneur launches radical new in-home care concept." Beneath the photo, the article quoted her thanking her family for their unwavering support, before casually mentioning that her older sister, Cressida, had unfortunately let personal envy distance her from the venture. I didn't cry. Instead, I traced the edge of the cheap newsprint until the black ink stained my thumb, listening to the rhythmic, labored breathing of our grandmother, Maeve, sleeping in the hospital bed set up in my living room. Linnea hadn't spent a night in this house since Maeve's stroke 14 months ago. She hadn't changed a soiled sheet, memorized a medication schedule, or watched a bank account slowly bleed dry to afford specialized physical therapy. But during her brief, sporadic 15-minute visits, dressed in tailored blazers that smelled of expensive citrus perfume, she had listened to me. I had poured my heart out to her at this very kitchen table, showing her my detailed spreadsheets, my drafted training manuals, and my unique blueprint for a dignified, holistic elder care agency born from my own exhaustion. I called it the Hearthway method. Linnea called it a cute little coping mechanism, right up until she registered the trademark under her own LLC. When I called our mother, Thora, hopping for a shred of maternal sanity, the phone line was quiet for a long moment. I could hear the clinking of her gardening shears in the background. "Cressida, darling," Thora sighed, her voice dripping with that familiar, exhausting brand of forced mediation. "Linnea has business acumen. You have a big heart. It takes a certain kind of person to scale an idea, and frankly, you've been so consumed by your grief over Maeve's decline that you're projecting. Linnea told me how angry you were when she tried to help. It's not a good look, sweetie. Don't let jealousy ruin this family." The word jealousy tasted like ash in my mouth. It was the perfect armor Linnea had constructed. By telling everyone, our family, our mutual friends, the local business community, that I was a bitter, envious older sister, she preemptively neutralized any truth I could tell. If I claimed the idea was mine, it was just my jealousy talking. If I pointed out that she had copied my proprietary client matching algorithm word for word, it was just my resentment because she was the successful one. At 4:00 p.m., the front door clicked open. Linnea walked into the foyer, holding a single artisanal bakery box. She didn't look at the newsletter sitting open on the counter. Instead, she offered me a soft, pitying smile, the kind reserved for a troubled child. "I brought those almond croissants you like," she said softly, keeping her voice down so as not to wake Maeve. "I thought we could finally put all this unpleasantness behind us, Cressida. I'm doing this for all of us, you know." I looked from the bakery box to her immaculate manicure, my own hands rough and dry from antibacterial soap. "You used my exact intake forms, Linnea. You even kept the typo on page 12. Linnea's smile didn't fade, but her eyes hardened into flint. She leaned in closer, the scent of her citrus perfume suffocating the smell of lavender and antiseptic in the air. "An idea belongs to the person who executes it, sister. Right now, you're a burnt-out caretaker living in a house that smells like old age. Who do you think the town is going to believe?" The silence that followed her words was heavy, broken only by the distant, metallic tick of the kitchen clock. Linnea set the bakery box down on the counter with a soft, deliberate click, her rings catching the dim afternoon light. For a fleeting second, I wanted to scream, to throw the newsletter in her face, to break the quiet dignity I had spent over a year maintaining in this house. But looking at her, so polished, so entirely convinced of her own narrative, a cold, sudden stillness settled over me. "I'm going to check on Maeve," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the anger she was clearly expecting. Linnea blinked, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing her features before her poised mask slipped back into place. "Good idea. I'll just leave the pastries here." In the back bedroom, the air was cooler. Maeve lay propped up on her pillows, her frail hands resting over a faded patchwork quilt. Her gray eyes, once sharp enough to spot a weed in a neighbor's yard from 50 yards away, found mine. The stroke had stolen the right side of her body and most of her speech, leaving her trapped in a quiet world of fragments. I sat in the vinyl chair beside her, gently taking her left hand. Her fingers squeezed mine with surprising, desperate strength. Cress, she mumbled, her tongue thick. The girls. I'm here, Maeve, I whispered, smoothing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Linea's out there, too. Maeve's brow furrowed, a low, frustrated sound humming in her throat. She looked toward the half-open door, then back at me, her eyes clouded with an old, deep-seated awareness. Maeve wasn't foolish. Before her illness, she had built the small family orchard from nothing, dealing with local suppliers and navigating bad harvests with a steel spine. She knew her daughters, and she knew her granddaughters. She had seen how Thora always smoothed the path for Linnea, and how I was always expected to carry the weight. When I returned to the kitchen, Linnea was gone, leaving only the scent of citrus and the untouched bakery box. The next morning, the fallout began. I received a text from Aunt Vive, Thora's younger sister, asking if I was doing okay and mentioning how sad it was when sibling rivalry tore apart a beautiful business opportunity. Then came an email from the local printing shop, a small business run by a man named Arthur, who had been a friend of my father's before he passed. Arthur had printed my initial test layouts for the Hearthway method pamphlets 6 months ago. Hi, Cressida, the email read. Your sister Linnea stopped by today to place a massive order for her new launch. She mentioned you two had a disagreement about the direction of the company and that you decided to step back to focus entirely on Maeve. Just wanted to check in. I have your old drafts saved if you ever want to pick them back up, but Linnea's branding looks incredibly professional. My stomach plummeted. She wasn't just launching, she was systematically erasing my footprints, replacing them with a narrative that painted me as incompetent, fragile, and bitter. She was using Arthur's loyalty to our family to legitimize her theft. I leaned against the kitchen sink, staring out at the overgrown backyard. My bank account was sitting at just under $400, the last of my savings swallowed by Maeve's specialized medication that the insurance company refused to cover. Linnea's new venture was set to host its official launch gala at the local country club in 2 weeks. I looked down at my hands, still rough, still smelling of lavender soap. Linnea believed I was trapped by my circumstances. She believed that my love for Maeve made me weak and that my poverty made me powerless. But as I watched a lone crow land on the rusted clothesline outside, a realization began to take root. Linnea had stolen the blueprints, the manuals, and the names, but she had never actually done the work. She didn't know the cracks in the foundation. The following Monday, the weather turned brittle and gray. I spent the morning sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of Maeve's old medical bills and a legal pad, mapping out the precise timeline of the Hearthway method. Every proprietary detail Linnea had stolen was rooted in a practical necessity she didn't understand. She had taken my dynamic care scheduling model, a system designed to prevent caregiver burnout by rotating high-stress tasks. But on her glossy new website, she was advertising it as a maximum efficiency profit matrix. She was treating human beings like inventory. Around noon, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. It wasn't Linnea, it was our mother, Thora. She hurried up the porch steps, shielding her fresh blowout from the damp wind, carrying a heavy designer tote bag. When she entered the kitchen, she didn't ask how Maeve had slept, nor did she look at the medical bills scattered across the table. Instead, she set down a heavy, bound folder with a gold-embossed logo, Lena Care Solutions. Linnea wanted me to drop this off, Thora said, her voice bright and brittle as glass. She took off her leather gloves and began arranging her hair in the reflection of my microwave door. It's the official family prospectus. Linnea is offering you a 5% non-voting equity stake in the company, Cressida. She's being incredibly generous. Considering, well, everything. I didn't touch the folder. A non-voting stake, in exchange for what, Mom? Thora sighed, a dramatic, long-suffering sound that she usually reserved for when the country club caterers ran out of Prosecco. In exchange for your signature on a standard non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement. It's just a formality, darling, to make sure there's no public awkwardness. Linnea has major investors looking at her now, including the Miller family. We can't have you telling local business owners that she stole your diary entries. They weren't diary entries. They were operational manuals, I said, my voice dropping an octave, deadly calm. And 5% of a company built on a lie is worth exactly nothing. Cressida, stop it, Thora's mask slipped, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp resentment. Look at yourself. You've let your hair go, your clothes look 20 years old, and you're hoarding your grandmother in this tiny house like a martyr. Linnea is trying to build a legacy for this family. She has the drive you always lacked. If you sign this, she's even offered to pay for a private facility for Maeve. A nice one, out by the highway. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. Out by the highway. A sterile, understaffed warehouse where Maeve would fade away in 3 months. Maeve, who had held Thora's hand through her divorces, who had kept this family afloat when our father died. Before I could answer, a soft, scratching sound came from the baby monitor on the counter. Maeve was awake. Thora didn't offer to come down the hall with me. She stayed in the kitchen, checking her phone, while I walked into the dim bedroom. Maeve's eyes were wide, fixed on the doorway. She had heard. Even with her damaged brain, she understood the word facility. A single, heavy tear leaked from the corner of her left eye, dampening her pillowcase. I knelt beside the bed, pressing my face into her frail shoulder, smelling the comforting, familiar scent of her cocoa butter lotion. I'm not sending you away, I whispered into the quiet room. I promise you, Maeve, she's not taking this house, and she's not taking you. When I went back to the kitchen, Thora was already standing by the front door, her tote bag slung over her arm. The papers are on the table, she said coldly, not looking at me. Linnea needs them signed by Friday before the gala. Don't be foolish, Cressida. You can't afford to play the victim forever. After the door clicked shut, I picked up the Lena Care Solutions prospectus. I flipped through the pages, looking past the stock photos of smiling elders and the generic corporate mission statements. Then, on the very last page, I saw the list of advisory board members and early-stage clients. Linnea had already signed up 3 of our town's most prominent, wealthy families for her premium care packages, including the elderly matriarch of the Miller family, who suffered from severe vascular dementia. Linnea had promised them 24/7 specialized cognitive behavioral care using the Lena Care blueprint. But as I looked closer at her staff directory, I realized she hadn't hired a single certified nurse or licensed therapist. She had hired cheap, untrained college students to save on overhead. She wasn't just stealing my business idea. To impress her investors, she was setting up a dangerous, volatile disaster, and she had no idea how to stop it. On Wednesday morning, the first crack in Linnea's polished facade appeared, though no one else could see it yet. I was at the local pharmacy, waiting for Maeve's prescription refill, when I ran into Beverly Miller. Beverly was the daughter-in-law of Mrs. Evelyn Miller, the wealthy matriarch listed on Linnea's prospectus. Beverly looked exhausted, her coat buttoned up wrong, her fingers nervously twisting her car keys. Cressida, she said, leaning against the pharmacy counter with a tired sigh. I heard you stepped back from the new agency to focus on Maeve. Linnea mentioned you were overwhelmed. I'm focusing on Maeve's care, yes, I replied, keeping my voice gentle, refusing to bite at the bait of Linnea's insult. How is Evelyn doing? Beverly rubbed her temples. We started with Lena Care's premium service on Monday. Linnea promised a customized cognitive routine, but the young girl they sent yesterday didn't even know what vascular dementia was. When Evelyn had a sundowning episode and started crying for her late husband, the girl panicked and locked herself in the guest bathroom. I had to rush home from work. Beverly looked at me, her eyes pleading. Linnea said it was just a temporary scheduling hiccup. But Evelyn is so fragile, Cressida. Vascular dementia requires predictable, quiet routines, Beverly, I said softly, my heart aching for the older woman. If the caregiver panics, the patient feels the adrenaline. They mirror the fear. Beverly stared at me, a sudden realization dawning on her face. You actually understand it. Linnea just kept throwing corporate slogans at me. Before she could say more, the pharmacist called my name, and Beverly's phone began to ring. She gave me a tight, grateful smile and hurried away. When I got home, I found a legal notice folded neatly and shoved into my mailbox. It was a formal demand letter from a high-priced law firm in the city, hired by Linnea. It stated that if I did not sign the non-disclosure agreement and the 5% equity transfer by Friday at 5:00 p.m., 3 hours before her grand launch gala, Lena Care Solutions would file a preemptive defamation lawsuit against me for spreading malicious falsehoods damaging to the company's valuation. They were trying to legally bankrupt me before I could even open my mouth. I sat at the kitchen table, looking at the crisp, heavy paper of the legal threat. Then I looked down at the old spiral notebook where I had meticulously logged every single symptom, reaction, and breakthrough Maeve had experienced over the last 14 months. This notebook wasn't just a diary. It was a clinical roadmap. It contained the exact operational adjustments that made my method work, adjustments Linnea didn't possess because she had only copied the front-facing marketing materials from my computer. I picked up my phone and made a call to Arthur, the family friend at the print shop. "Arthur, it's Cressida," I said when he answered. "Those old drafts of mine you still have on your server. The ones with the detailed medical emergency protocols and the caregiver training modules. Do they have a digital timestamp from 6 months ago?" "Of course they do, Cress," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "They're logged under your personal account from last November. Why? Is everything okay? Your sister's launch is all the town is talking about." "Arthur, I need you to print 5 high-quality, bound copies of those original, time-stamped documents for me," I said, my hand gripping the phone tightly. "And I need them by Friday afternoon. Can you do that for my father's sake?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the heavy thrum of his industrial printers in the background. "For your dad, absolutely, Cressida. They'll be ready." As I hung up, I walked back into Maeve's room. She was awake, watching the rain beat against the glass. I leaned down and smoothed her blanket. "The gala is Friday, Maeve," I whispered. "Linnea thinks she bought the town, but she forgot that a house built on stolen dirt can't stand a storm." By Thursday night, the house felt entirely too quiet. A heavy fog had rolled in off the river, wrapping around the porch and blurring the streetlights into distant, yellow smudges. I sat on the edge of Maeve's bed, applying a thick layer of barrier cream to her heels to prevent pressure sores. A tedious, unglamorous task that required patience and a steady hand. Maeve was quiet, her breathing synchronized with the soft hum of the humidifier. Suddenly, the headlights of a car sliced through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the bedroom ceiling. A car door slammed. A moment later, the front door opened without a knock. It was Linnea. She didn't look like the poised CEO from the Chamber of Commerce newsletter. Her hair was slightly damp from the fog, and her cheeks were flushed. She marched down the hallway, her designer heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor, stopping right at the threshold of Maeve's room. She didn't look at our grandmother. She looked directly at me. "You spoke to Beverly Miller," Linnea hissed, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper. "She called my office this afternoon demanding to see the specific training credentials of the staff assigned to her mother-in-law. She mentioned your name, Cressida. She said you seemed highly concerned about the quality of care." I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on a clean hand towel, and stepped out into the hallway, pulling Maeve's door shut behind me to protect her peace. "Beverly was anxious, Linnea. I didn't tell her anything she hadn't already witnessed herself." "You are sabotaging me," Linnea snarled, stepping into my personal space, the scent of her citrus perfume corrupted by the sour smell of stress sweat. "You're doing exactly what Mom said you'd do. You're trying to drag me down to your level because you're stuck in this pathetic, miserable routine, and you can't stand that I'm actually making something of myself." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the desperate, frantic panic flashing behind her eyes. Linnea wasn't brilliant. She was just fast. She had raced to the finish line with a stolen map, and now that she was there, she was realizing she didn't know how to navigate the terrain. "The Miller family is paying you $4,000 a month for a specialized service you cannot provide," I said, keeping my voice dead even, entirely devoid of inflection. "If Evelyn Miller wanders out into the street during a sundowning episode because your untrained college student is looking at her phone, that isn't a sibling rivalry issue, Linnea. That's a criminal negligence issue." Linnea laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cracked in the narrow hallway. "Oh, please, don't lecture me from your moral high ground. You have until 5:00 p.m. tomorrow to sign those papers, Cressida. If your signature isn't on my lawyer's desk, I will file the lawsuit before the first champagne bottle is popped at the gala. I'll sue you for tortious interference, and I will take this house. I will take everything you have left." She turned on her heel and stormed out, the front door rattling the window panes as it slammed shut. I stood in the dark hallway for a long time, the silence settling back over the house like dust. I wasn't shaking. For the first time in 14 months, the crushing weight of exhaustion left me. I walked into the kitchen, picked up my phone, and typed a single message to Arthur at the print shop. "Make sure the timestamps are visible on the front cover of every copy, Arthur. I'm coming to pick them up tomorrow at noon." Friday arrived with a blinding, frigid clarity. The fog from the night before had frozen into a delicate crust of frost over the lawn, making the gravel driveway crunch loudly under my boots as I walked out to my rusted sedan at noon. I drove straight to Arthur's print shop on Main Street. The bell above the door jingled softly, and Arthur immediately stepped out from behind the heavy cutting counter, holding a heavy cardboard box wrapped in brown butcher paper. He set it down between us, his face lined with an uncomfortable mixture of sympathy and anxiety. "They're all in here, Cressida. 5 copies, bound with thick black spines. The digital timestamp from November 14th of last year is stamped directly across the bottom of the title pages in bold red ink. It's undeniable." He lowered his voice, glancing toward the street. "Your mother stopped by an hour ago. She was picking up the custom seating placards for the gala tonight. She saw me boxing these up and asked what they were." My chest tightened. "What did you tell her, Arthur?" "I told her it was just old archival work for your father's estate," Arthur said, giving my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "But she looked suspicious. Be careful, Cress. Linnea has the whole town's money behind her tonight. People don't like finding out they bought a fake product, but they like it even less when you ruin their party." "I'm not trying to ruin a party, Arthur. I'm trying to protect my grandmother," I said softly, taking the box. When I returned home, the phone was already ringing. It was Linnea's corporate attorney, a man named Vance whose voice sounded like it had been dry-cleaned. "Ms. Miller," he said, his tone dripping with professional condescension. "It is currently 2:00 p.m. I am reminding you that we have not received the executed non-disclosure and equity transfer documents. If they are not in my inbox by 5:00 p.m. sharp, my instructions are to file the civil complaint immediately. There will be no further extensions." "Thank you, Mr. Vance," I said, staring at the brown cardboard box on my kitchen table. "You'll have my answer by 5." I spent the next 2 hours meticulously feeding Maeve her lunch, spooning the pureed sweet potatoes into her mouth with a slow, rhythmic patience. She was unusually alert, her eyes tracking my movements with an intense, quiet intelligence. When I wiped her chin, she suddenly reached out her good left hand and pinched the fabric of my sleeve, tugging it weakly. "Go," she croaked, her voice raspy but firm. "Go, fix it." A small, tearful laugh escaped my throat. I kissed her forehead, smelling the comforting lavender soap. "I will, Maeve, I promise." At 4:15 p.m., I left Maeve in the trusted care of Mrs. Gable, our dependable next-door neighbor who had helped me out during emergencies in the past. I didn't dress in a tailored blazer or put on expensive citrus perfume. I wore my plain charcoal wool coat, my sensible winter boots, and carried the heavy cardboard box under my arm. I didn't drive to the lawyer's office. Instead, I drove straight toward the North Shore Country Club, where the parking lot was already filling with luxury vehicles under the glowing white fairy lights draped through the oak trees. The grand launch gala was scheduled to begin at 6:00 p.m., but the advisory board, the key investors, and my family were already inside for the private, pre-event VIP reception. It was 4:45 p.m. when I walked through the heavy mahogany double doors of the country club. The warmth of the indoor heating hit me, carrying the scent of expensive catering and champagne. From the end of the carpeted hallway, I could hear the distinct, melodic sound of Linnea's laughter echoing from the private dining room. She thought she had won. She thought the clock had run out on me. The private dining room was bathed in a soft, amber glow from the crystal chandeliers overhead. A long table in the center held silver platters of delicate hors d'oeuvres, and several ice buckets cradled bottles of vintage champagne. There were perhaps 15 people in the room, the town's financial elite, including the entire Miller family, 3 members of the city council, and our mother, Thora, who was currently laughing at something a prominent real estate developer was saying. Linnea stood near the fireplace, looking breathtaking in a tailored ivory pantsuit. She held a crystal flute of champagne, her face radiant with the absolute certainty of her impending triumph. The room fell completely silent the moment the heavy double doors clicked shut behind me. Thora was the first to react. Her smile froze, her glass tilting slightly as her eyes darted to the heavy cardboard box cradled under my arm. She quickly excused herself from her conversation and hurried across the room, her high heels muffled by the thick Persian rug. She grabbed my upper arm with a grip that was entirely too tight, her voice a harsh, frantic whisper. "Cressida, what on earth are you doing here? Look at your boots, you're tracking slush onto the carpet. If you came to deliver the signed papers to Linnea's lawyer, he's in the lobby. Get out of here before you make a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Mom," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. I gently but firmly disengaged my arm from her grip and walked toward the center of the room. Linnea's eyes narrowed into slits as I approached. She set her champagne flute down on the mantelpiece with a sharp clink. "Cressida," she said, her voice dropping into that smooth, practiced tone of public pity she had perfected. "It's 4:55 p.m. I assume you're here to finalize our agreement, but this is a private reception for our founding investors. It's highly inappropriate for you to burst in like this." Beverly Miller, who was sitting on a plush velvet sofa near the fire next to her husband, leaned forward, her eyes darting between me and my sister with intense curiosity. "I'm not here to sign your papers, Linnea," I said, placing the heavy cardboard box flat on the white linen tablecloth, right next to a platter of smoked salmon. I tore the brown butcher paper open, revealing the 5 sleek black-bound volumes inside. Linnea took a step forward, her face flushing a dangerous, dark red beneath her perfect makeup. "Vance," she called out sharply toward the door. "Vance, get in here right now and handle this." "Mr. Vance can't help you with what's in this box, Linnea," I said calmly. I picked up the first volume and slid it across the table, right into the hands of Beverly Miller's husband, who automatically caught it. I handed the second copy directly to Beverly. "What is this?" Beverly asked, looking down at the heavy cover page. "That," I said, looking Linnea straight in the eye, "is the original, complete operational blueprint for the Hearthway method. It includes the proprietary caregiver rotation schedule, the specialized vascular dementia stabilization protocols, and the emergency escalation matrices. If you look at the bottom of the title page, you will see a certified digital timestamp from the local printing press, logged under my name on November 14th of last year. Exactly 9 months before Linnea registered her LLC. The room grew so still that the only sound was the soft, rhythmic crackle of the wood fire behind Linnea. Beverly Miller's husband flipped open the heavy black cover, his thumb catching on the crisp white pages. His eyes scanned the text, then tracked down to the bold red ink at the bottom of the title page. "November 14th, he read aloud, his voice cutting through the heavy air. He looked up, his brow furrowing as he turned to his wife. "Beverly, isn't this the exact phrasing from the prospectus we signed last week? The holistic integration matrix?" "It's word for word, Richard," Beverly whispered. She didn't look at the document in her hands. She was staring directly at Linnea, her expression hardening from curiosity into a cold, clinical disgust. "Linnea, you told us you spent 3 years developing this methodology in Chicago." Linnea's corporate lawyer, Mr. Vance, finally rushed into the room, his leather briefcase held like a shield. He took one look at the bound volumes on the table, then at the prominent investors already reading them, and his professional composure visibly crumbled. He stepped toward me, his voice trembling slightly. "Ms. Miller, you are under a strict timeline to execute a non-disclosure agreement. This performance constitutes a blatant violation of—" "A violation of what, Mr. Vance?" I interrupted, my voice perfectly level, carrying an authority that made him stop in his tracks. "I haven't signed your agreement. I'm a private citizen sharing my own copyrighted, time-stamped intellectual property with members of my community. There is no defamation here, because every single word in those volumes is the absolute truth. Thora stepped between me and Linnea, her hands shaking so violently she had to drop her designer tote bag onto a chair. Cressida, stop this madness right now. You are ruining your sister's life. You've always been like this, petty, jealous, unable to bear it when Linnea shines. She turned to the room, her voice rising in a desperate, frantic pitch. Please, everyone, ignore her. My older daughter has been under an immense amount of psychological strain caretaking for my mother. She isn't well. She's imagining things. It was an old wound, the familiar sting of my mother rewriting my reality to protect her favorite child. But this time, the poison didn't take. I looked at Thora, feeling nothing but a profound, quiet pity. I'm not imagining the typo on page 12, Mom, I said softly. Richard Miller looked up from his copy, his thumb tracing the page. She's right. Page 12 of the Lena Care Manual has a misplaced semicolon in the emergency contact protocol. It's right here in this November draft, too. He closed the volume with a heavy, decisive thud that echoed like a gavel. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, and looked at the other board members in the room. This isn't a sibling rivalry. This is a fraudulent misrepresentation of a medical care framework. Linnea finally spoke. The smooth, melodic voice she used for networking was gone, replaced by a raw, ragged edge of pure desperation. Richard, please, it's just paperwork. The business model works. I have the infrastructure, I have the capital. You don't have the training, Linnea, Beverly Miller said, standing up to join her husband. She didn't raise her voice, which made her words cut even deeper. You sent a frightened 19-year-old girl to manage my mother's vascular dementia, using a manual you didn't even write. You lied to us about your expertise to get our signature on a check. Beverly turned to me, her eyes softening with a deep, aching regret. Cressida, I am so incredibly sorry we didn't listen to you sooner. The grand mahogany doors of the country club did not swing open for the public launch gala that night. By 6:15 p.m., the catering staff was quietly packing away the untouched platters of smoked salmon, and the ice in the champagne buckets had melted into tepid pools of water. Outside in the freezing drizzle, a representative from the club was turning away bewildered guests at the gate, murmuring vague excuses about a sudden administrative postponement. Inside the private dining room, the silence was absolute. The investors had left in a slow, grim procession, their expressions a mix of quiet fury and legal calculation. Richard Miller had taken his copy of my original manual with him, stating bluntly that his family's attorneys would be in touch with Linnea's representation by Monday morning. Mr. Vance, the high-priced corporate lawyer, was the last to leave. He didn't say goodbye. He simply snapped his briefcase shut, avoided everyone's eyes, and slipped out the side door into the rain. That left only the three of us. Linnea sat slumped in a gilded chair by the dying fire, her immaculate ivory pantsuit looking suddenly too large for her. The mask of the brilliant, untouchable CEO had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, hollowed-out girl who looked younger than her years. Her hands rested limp in her lap, her fingernails digging into her palms. Thora paced the length of the Persian rug, her breathing shallow and ragged. She stopped near the window, watching the tail lights of the investors' cars disappear down the long, winding driveway. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Thora whispered, turning to face me. Her voice wasn't angry anymore. It was reedy, thin, and brittle with a desperate, mounting panic. "The social fallout from this, the gossip. The Millers control half the charity boards in this county, Cressida. Our family name is ruined. Linnea's career is over before it even started." "Linnea's career as a thief is over, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air with a quiet, immovable weight. I stood near the edge of the table, my charcoal coat still damp from the sleet outside. "Her actual life is perfectly intact. She just has to live it honestly now." Linnea slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her mascara smudged at the corners. For the first time in my life, she didn't look at me with pity or smug condescension. She looked at me with a profound, unadulterated fear. "You're going to open it, aren't you?" she croaked, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the embers. "Now that you've destroyed my company, you're going to launch the Hearthway method yourself. You're going to take everything I wanted." I looked down at the remaining black-bound volumes on the table. I'm going to take care of Maeve, Linnea. That is the only thing I have ever wanted to do. The difference between you and me isn't a business acumen or a marketing budget. The difference is that I actually love the people I'm trying to serve. You wanted a legacy built on glossy paper. I just wanted our grandmother to die with some dignity in her own bed. I picked up the last 2 copies of my manual, tucked them securely under my arm, and turned toward the door. Cressida, wait, Thora called out, taking a step toward me, her hand reaching out instinctively. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of regret in her eyes, a sudden, terrifying realization that she had bet on the wrong daughter, that she had completely alienated the only child who had ever truly carried the family's burdens. We can talk about this. We can fix this as a family. I paused at the threshold, the heavy brass door handle cool beneath my hand. I looked back at my mother and my sister, framed by the dying luxury of a room they couldn't afford. There's nothing left to talk about, Mom, I said softly. The paperwork is done. Drive back to the house was the quietest 20 minutes of my life. The windshield wipers swept a steady, rhythmic cadence against the freezing rain, clearing a path through the dark, empty country roads. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the warm, soft light from the front porch window was bleeding through the bare maple trees, casting a golden glow over the frozen lawn. It looked like a sanctuary. I stepped inside, the familiar, comforting scent of lavender, old wood, and cocoa butter enveloping me like a heavy blanket. Mrs. Gable was sitting in the kitchen, a half-empty mug of chamomile tea between her hands. She looked up as I closed the door, her eyes searching my face before she gave me a gentle, understanding nod. She's been resting peacefully, Cressida, Mrs. Gable whispered, standing up and smoothing her sweater. She woke up once about an hour ago, looked toward the hall, and then just went back to sleep. She knew you were handling things. Thank you, Clara, I said, my voice thick with an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel all day. For everything. After Mrs. Gable left, I walked down the dim hallway and stepped into Maeve's bedroom. The humidifier hummed its low, comforting song in the corner. I sat down in the vinyl chair beside her bed and looked at her frail, weathered face in the soft light of the nightlight. The heavy, suffocating tension that had gripped my chest for months was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion that felt remarkably clean. I didn't win a grand fortune tonight. I didn't become a celebrated CEO, and my name wouldn't be featured in the next Chamber of Commerce newsletter. On Monday, I would still have to call the pharmacy to work out a payment plan for Maeve's physical therapy supplies. I would still have to scrub the floors, wash the linens, and budget every single dollar down to the penny. But as I reached out and gently took Maeve's left hand, her small fingers instinctively curled around mine, squeezing with that familiar, stubborn strength. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from the Miller family's estate coordinator. It wasn't a legal threat. It was a formal, private inquiry asking if I would be open to consulting for their family on an independent basis, to help train a small, licensed staff to care for Evelyn in her own home using my specific protocols. They offered a monthly retainer that would completely cover Maeve's medical expenses with room to breathe. I left the letter open on the kitchen counter, right where the local newsletter had sat a week ago. Linnea and Thora hadn't called, and I knew they wouldn't. The silence from them wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary, finally drawn in stone. They were trapped in the wreckage of a public lie, scrambling to protect a reputation that had never been real. I walked out onto the back porch, holding a hot cup of coffee, and watched the morning sun slowly melt the frost off the old orchard trees. My hands were still rough, and the porch steps still creaked under my feet, but the air felt incredibly clear. I was exactly where I belonged, holding the truth in my hands, completely free.